Okay, so just to finish off now with these interior renders for this space, I just want to go over decals, and then if we have time I'll look at axonometric views as well. But starting with decals, I want to put a rug on the floor there between these chairs. So a simple way is again using one of these things called a decal. And so have any of you heard about that term or heard that term used before, decal? Oh yeah, but just more generally, do you know what it means, decal? It's an old word for sticker, basically. Okay. Right, so decal just means sticker, and that's the way it's used in America and a lot of other countries. When they talk about decals, they actually mean something more general than a tool in Revit. But it is... Oh, yeah, I will. Or do you want to watch? Have you done decals?
No.
Okay, well, you should just watch. Yeah, oh, well, it won't take very long, but you should watch what we're doing on decals. So, okay, so I'll start with this image here, and then I'm just going to save it. So by right-clicking, we can just save the picture, and I'll save it somewhere you can get to. And I've got a folder full of these things on the P drive under Material Images. And then I've got a rugs folder. You can see we've got quite a few there already. And so I'll just add this to the collection. And remember what it's called, Sewer Pom Pom. That's it, Sewer Pom Pom. Okay. And so then I'm going to go into Photoshop and open that file. Okay, so I've got my my rug image, of course, and now I want to take out the white part, and so I'm going to select that using Magic Wand over on the left, and then I'm going to take the tolerance down to, I'm going to try about 5, and then make sure contiguous, sorry, is turned on. And then click there in that white area to select that, and I'm going to zoom in. Here I'm holding down Alt so I can use the wheel to zoom. I'm always surprised how many people who use Photoshop quite a bit don't know that one. So with Alt you can make Photoshop zoom just like it does in Revit. And I'm making sure that there are no parts inside that are selected, because this one is pretty close to being white. So I just want to make sure that the Magic Wand isn't picking up any of those areas. Sorry. Okay, so now I'm going to fill that just by going to Edit and then Fill. And then I'm going to choose black from the menu there. Click OK, and of course it's filled with black. And now I'm going to go to the Select menu and then go to Inverse. So I'm selecting the rug essentially now. And then under Edit, again go to Fill, and this time change it to white. So I've got a black and white image, with the white part being the part I want to keep, or show in my decal. So then I'm just going to go to Save As, and save this as a new file. So I'm just going to call this, well, it's got cut out in the file name already, which is confusing, but I'm going to change that to Sewer Pom Pom, let's call it mask, because mask means something similar to cut out in rendering. And so now going back into Revit, I'll just go to the Insert tab and then Decal, place Decal, and because it's the first decal, it'll come up with this dialog box. Then I can just click Create New Decal at the bottom, and I'll call this Rug 1. And then while it's selected over on the right, I'm going to go to Browse next to Source there, and then choose my image that I've just saved. So there it is. But then I'm also going to go down to cutouts at the bottom and change that to image file. And then again go to Browse next to Source there at the end. And this time choose that black and white file I've just made. So that way, wherever it's black, this image is going to be transparent. Otherwise I'd have the white area sitting around my rug, which I don't want. So that's it. I'm going to click OK. And then I can place that on the ground just by clicking. So that's gone in. I'm going to press Escape so that I can then come back and select that and then stretch it just by dragging the corners. So you can see that's worked fairly well, but maybe these areas don't look too great because there's a lot of white around them. So I've left that deliberately so I can show you how easy it is to go back and adjust. So I'll go back to the masking image and I'll open up the original. So we'll go back and open this file. So that's the file that I started with. So an easy way of moving everything from one layer to another file is simply to select all. So I'll go to Select All from the Select menu. Control A is the shortcut for that. Then I'll copy. So again, under Edit you can choose Copy or Control C. And then go to the file I want to bring that into and then paste. And again, shortcut Control V. So Control A, Control C, Control V, in that order. We'll select all, copy, and then paste. And that's something you'll do quite a lot in Photoshop. So I've copied everything from this file into a new layer with the file with the cutout. And you can see they line up exactly, which makes sense because they started off from the same file. So now I want to go back with layer 1 there. And I'm just going to use the opacity slider to make this fade a bit. Basically so I can see the black and white underneath. And this is a good thing. If you're new to Photoshop, it's a good way of practicing with the editing tools. So I'm going to then zoom into my tassels and we can see these white parts all around the actual tassels themselves. So I'm going to go to the background layer and then I'm going to go to the brush tool over on the left. I'm going to make sure it's on black. So over on the foreground and background colour, you can see it's on black and white with black at the top. You've got a button just above that that you can use to set those default colours back to black and white. So that little button above that looks like a mini version of the same thing, you can use to, again, reset the black and white. And if white's on top, you can just use the button above that to flip the foreground and background colours. So now I want to make my brush smaller before I start painting. So at first, probably it's good to look at right-clicking. And you can always just drag the slider there to change the size. But the shortcut is the square brackets on your keyboard. So you can use the square brackets to reduce the size of the brush. And now I can just paint in between and paint out those white parts. Okay, so as I turn the top layer off, you can see what that's doing. It's painting in areas that it's going to cut out. So I'm not being too precise here because it's fabric after all. We don't need to have exact measurements for this. Okay, so I can just go over all those tassels and just paint away. I know it looks like it's grey, that's just because of the layer on top, but it actually is painting in black. And again, we can always turn this off just to see how it looks. And this is a pretty important concept. So in Photoshop, you find you do a lot of masking. And this is essentially what I'm doing here. So I'm using a mask, that's the black and white layer, to take out the parts that I want hidden. Now we'll do some Photoshop layout things later, but again, this is a really good way of just practicing with the basic tools in Photoshop using the brush. And again, this one here is really obvious, so that's an easy one we can paint out. And again, I'll just make the brush a bit bigger there. And again, you don't have to be very precise here. You can just do this roughly by eye, essentially. So I'm just painting in there where I want to cut out my tassels. So don't worry about those black bits we can see, because it really only is the layer underneath that I'm worried about. Okay, so there we are. So I'll leave it like that, and then, okay, so again, turning off the top layer, you can see what's underneath. So now I'm just going to go to Save As, change it to JPEG, and then save over the file that I've just created, and say yes to override it. Okay, so back into Revit, and then I'm just going to reload that file. Well, you can see there it's actually picked it up already. Notice how those tassels now are cut out, and they weren't before. Okay, so does that make sense, using a mask to cut things out? And it's usually going to be a black and white layer or a file. So is that something most of you have done, or not yet, or a little bit?
Not the mask.
Yeah.
I would normally do I don't do it that way, but I haven't done this way before.
Oh, you haven't done masks before, or?
Not that way, no.
Right, yeah.
I've done a layer mask, but that's
Oh,
not
layer masks are very similar. Yeah, they're really similar because they're black and white as well.
Yeah.
So that's a good thing, yeah. Yeah, that's right. In these shaded views, that shows with that. You can't really do much about that. But when you render, it won't show when you render. So I'll just go to a perspective view. So I should have one there. There we are.
That's the rest of it.
Yeah, yeah. So when we render, I don't have too many lights in here, but I'll just see how it goes. Okay, so you can see there when it's rendered. I know it's very dark on the screen, but it's definitely going to show without the border. I'll just make that a bit brighter. Okay, so you can see there it renders without that border. And that's really the main reason you do all of these things. And so if you practice with that, that'll get you a long way with Photoshop, but also with a lot of the setup of materials, because materials can also use a similar approach. Okay, so maybe I'll just finish up by showing you where I've got a lot of images that you can use for decals. So apart from that rugs folder, I've got one for things like paintings. Now, notice how this time, when I go to place decal, it doesn't come up with the dialog box. After you place the first one, you need to go to Edit Type, and then you can just duplicate any that you've made. So I'll just call this new one Painting, Painting 1. Click Edit, and then we get all the same settings we had before, it just looks a bit different. Okay, so this is a painting, so I don't really need to have a cutout, so I can turn the cutout back to none. And then I'll go to Browse. And then to show you, I've got a paintings folder with a lot of my favourite artists. If you go to paintings there, and then I've got a few downloaded. You can, of course, search and find a lot more than this, but have a look at these. So there's quite a few people there. That one says Anne Houck. It's actually not her. I got mixed up there. It was someone else. But here we go. Just put a Kenji skin or something. So, okay, so that's just an image of a painting. And I'll set the finish back to matte. We don't want this to be reflective. And that's it. So I'll just click OK there. And also the bump. We don't really want that to be bumped unless, well, nah, we won't worry about bumps. So I'll set that to 0 as well. Okay, so they can easily be placed on things like walls. And then again, you can select them and stretch your heart's content. So that's all done in proportion. If you want to stretch them with the height and width working separately, you can turn lock proportions off, and then you can stretch them. I wouldn't recommend doing it with a painting like this, but just so you know, that's how you can change the proportions if you want to. So that's it. And again, if we have a perspective, that'll show without the border, so it just looks like a poster stuck on the wall. And just need to go to realistic to see that. Yeah, that easy. Now you can of course add those things in Photoshop. You just need to do the perspective yourself, but sometimes that can be better because you do get more control in Photoshop. So for backgrounds and things like that, sometimes it is good to have these things as a background. So maybe, actually that's something we can look at very quickly. Oh yeah, look, it's a great thing for rendering, and these days it's almost becoming the standard. Even people who do a lot of high-end 3D rendering, they'll take all the different channels they get out of their 3D program and then work on it for a long time in Photoshop. Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Yeah. So maybe I'll bring this back a bit so you can see. So that's actually good if you spend some time looking at that, just gives me a chance to put in some extra lights here. And then, so I thought, yeah, it's a good chance if you want to go into Photoshop. If you've got a render where you can see through a window and you can see outside, you can see there, I've just got it with the lights on, but I can see through the windows, and I'll make it a bit brighter and maybe a bit cooler. That'll do. And normally I just go up to medium. Have any of you tried high quality in Revit? It does, and did you notice it looked, did you think it looked any good?
No.
It's not, it's a really hard one to work with because it's actually using a different rendering algorithm.
Oh.
It's a completely different tool to this, well, it's still ART, but it's got a lot of options turned on that are harder to work with.
Oh.
So I just recommend going to medium, and that'll be good enough in most cases. If you want to go higher than that, then have a think about using the cloud.
I use the cloud.
Yeah,
I use the cloud.
yeah, you should. That's much simpler. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. That's right. So then, yeah, so the resolution is something you should think about as well. So normally you want to go to printer. So with the cloud, when you choose large, that's actually increasing the pixels. So that's your resolution.
yeah.
So you've got the quality, which you can just set to final in the cloud, and then the size, or the image size. Large is usually okay, but extra large is going to give you, a bigger image if you need to do a poster or something like that. So this should finish in a second. Yeah, it's good. Yeah. But then you see, it gives you these computer-generated looking images quite often, and that's when you can then go into Photoshop and do a lot more work. So I won't change the resolution because it'll take too long to render, but again, if you go up to printer, that will increase the resolution. If you choose that, you can see it goes from this, well, it's actually lower, so you've got to have a look at the pixels, but there on 150 it's lower, but if you go to 300, that would be much higher on 300 dpi. Okay, so I'm going to export that and save it and just show you one last thing in Photoshop. Okay, so if you're going to work in Photoshop, often the best option is TIFF, but PNG is pretty close. PNGs give you a lot of the options that TIFF does as well. So I'm going to open this now, and fingers crossed it should give us the transparency. There we are. So notice how it's got this checkerboard pattern. That means it's transparent. So I'll add in a new layer in Photoshop. Just click the new layer button, and I'm going to drag that new layer to the bottom, just so that you can see if I paint in that colour or just fill. I'll just choose a pattern or something so that you can see. Okay, so it's going to fill that in behind the windows and everything else. So, just like that, and so we'll go and open up a background image. And again, I've got a whole collection of these. If you go to the P drive, interior design, material images, and then background and backgrounds both have backgrounds in them. So I'll go to backgrounds, and I think it's got more. Change the thumbnails, and I've got a few there, so I must have the rest in background. Yeah, that's the one with more. Okay, so there we are. So I've got some more in there. And again, you can easily search for skies and backgrounds, and you'll find many, many more. So maybe I want a dusk sort of sky, so I'll get that one, dusk sky. I'm just going to ignore the city there below it. So I just want the top part. So I'm going to select that. Will do. Again, edit, copy, and I'll go back to the original file, and then edit, and then I'll just do paste, paste actually. So there we are. So I've got a new, the layer that I made with this sky now added to it, and that means it can be adjusted separately if it's on a separate layer. And it's much, much easier than trying to do this in the rendering program. If you're trying to do this in 3D, it's much more involved. I won't say any more than that, but it's more complicated. So say if we go to, well, let's just do brightness contrast, because that's an easy one. Under image and then adjustments, brightness contrast, and then we can adjust the brightness of that sky without it affecting the render. And that's really helpful. Oh, that's from Revit. That's our road in Revit. Right, so I've got the road there from Revit. So that's just the way I've modelled it. right? So we could hide that, right? But it is the road, so it's good in a way because it shows us where the horizon is. So we don't really want the sky to be below that. We could maybe put in something on the ground that would look better, but we don't really want the sky to go all the way down. I know it's tempting, but it looks strange because, again, that's where the horizon should be. So here the main problem is that the sky is a bit small. So I'm zooming out so you can see what happens if I then use transform under edit. You can just go to free transform, which is Control T. And then you can see, oh, I didn't need to go out that far. There's my sky. So I can then scale that and move it to get the position that I want. Now watch what happened there. See how when I went to move it, it moved the whole thing? That's because this option here was on auto select. So with the move button, have a look and see if you want that option. With auto select, it'll pick the layer where you click. But if you turn it off, you can then choose a layer and then it'll only move that layer. Okay, so notice how it does a few nice things there. It keeps the reflections in front. That's all cut out from the glass. So yeah, it's pretty good. Actually, in some other 3D programs, that's a lot harder. So, so you can see there the reflections are on this other layer. So again, I can go back and, well, we can go to layer 0, where I've got the render, and I can go back to adjustments. And if you're, again, new to Photoshop, this is a good thing to go through. You should try most of these adjustment options and see how they work. So brightness contrast, it works pretty well. But you also have exposure, which is often better for things in perspective or camera type images. So here, exposure will do a similar thing to brightness, but it does work in a better way. And so then maybe I can think, well, the sky should be fairly dark here. It is meant to be a nighttime image, but again, maybe I can go back and use exposure to try and get the sky to come off a bit more. You want it fairly subtle probably, but again, you can adjust that. And gamma correction can be a good one to try with exposure as well. I won't explain that one, it's a bit technical, but your eyes will tell you when it's doing what you want. With exposure, it's you can see there, it gives, well again, I won't explain it properly, but again, as you adjust the exposure, you will see certain colours sometimes change in a way you don't want them to, especially brightness and darkness. So again, you can use the gamma correction to correct for that, essentially. Watch out for offset. Offset's flat, so when you use offset, you can see there it's like a flat brightness and contrast, and that one's probably going to give you the least useful results. You've got to use it sometimes, but normally you wouldn't. But again, gamma correction is a good one to look at. And again, use your eyes to tell you when you think it's worth it. It essentially makes it look real again after the exposure, can give you some artificial looking results. Okay, so there we are. So that can be a good setup using a transparency as well, and that's a good chance to go into Photoshop and start working with layers a bit more, and you can overlay your people and things like that. And have you all been doing that already with Photoshop, putting people and other things over on top of your renders?
Oh, yeah,
Yeah, do you know how to do that? You know?
well, it's just not get a person cut down.
Yeah, yeah, pretty much, yeah. Yeah, if you want to do it in a nice clean way, yeah, masking's a good way to start, and then you can convert that to a cutout if you want to, but even if you leave it as a mask, it's fine. Yeah, it's fine. That's how I do a lot of them. Yeah, that's good. So if you can do that, that's good. I won't show you that, because I want to leave you time to work on what you want to do. But, yeah. So again, my lights there, that's something you want to watch out for. When you get these really bright lights, that's overexposed. So I would definitely go back and take that exposure down. Pretty hard without re-rendering maybe, because they're so bright. But the gamma, no, it's not going to get me out of trouble there. But what I wouldn't recommend is trying to manually fix all of that in Photoshop. If you try and pick all the bright parts and then reduce them down, it's a lot of work. So sometimes you're just better off re-rendering. But don't worry if you've done all the work in Photoshop. If you've got your people sitting over the top and your background in the background, you can easily just reinsert that render layer and it should all line up exactly. So that's how you do Photoshop, or use Photoshop along with Revit for your renders. And again, for things like decals, it's really nice to be able to have those things cut out, but otherwise just having flat decals on a wall or other surface usually is going to give you everything you need. Can't think of too many other things there, so yeah, I'll just finish that unless there's anything else you want to look at with just basic Photoshop.
No, I think so.
Yeah,
Sorry.
that's right. Yep, that's right. Okay, so maybe just to finish off there, I'll look at the image size, so we know how we're going to save this. So under image, if you go to image size, then you can see when it's come from Revit, it'll be 72 dpi. Do you know what standard print resolution is? Close, but half. Yeah, 300, yeah, exactly. 300 standard. You can go to 600 with some of the really new printers, but most printers won't even go to 600. So 300 is absolutely fine. And so then you can see it tells you, if you want to print it at 300, how big that's going to be. So that's with resample turned off. So I've just changed the resolution there, and you can see it's quite small, 8 by 6. That's if you want full resolution. In other words, if you want the full resolution from the renderer. So remember, back into Revit, we had that option when we went to printer to change it to 300 dpi. So that would have been that resolution, 300, with the image size here, 150 by 113. In other words, 15 centimetres by 11 centimetres. But I rendered it at lower resolution. So you can set it here. That's a good way to start. If you know it's going to be a certain size on your layout, set the size in Revit. Then when you choose 300 and then open it in Photoshop, you still have to come to here. Make sure you leave resample turned off and just change the resolution to 300, and then the size will come up exactly the same as what you've set it to in Revit. Okay, so I thought that's a good place to finish because, again, that will give you the full image size. So that should do it.